One little tip if you are using apparel woven is you need to pre-press your fabric. Make sure it's nice and wrinkle free before you even begin cutting out. If you don't pre-press your fabric, then your pieces could be off significantly because once you do press that wrinkle out, it's not going to be the correct shape. So make sure you take the time to pre-press your fabric. I'm using my projector here. I have a ceiling mounted projector and a nice big cutting mat. One little tip and trick, I'm doing the sleeved option for this video, but if you're doing the thin strap option, a little trick is to do these little dot markings on the lining piece and leave the main piece unmarked. That way you can mark it up with whatever you want, and it doesn't matter because it's the lining. I always recommend using a straight edge when you're cutting out straight pieces, no matter if you're using a projector or paper pieces, tracing paper, whatever you're cutting out, I still recommend using a straight edge on the straight pieces. It just helps get it nice and perfect. I'm using a quilting cotton here for baby girl. It's not something that I love to use, especially for myself. She doesn't pick it very often either because both of us think it's a little stiff and uncomfortable to wear. But she really liked the way this one looked. She wanted it to be a theme for her back to school, and this is what fit her theme that she wanted. So it does give it a really full twirly skirt because it's a little more stable and stiff. So the skirt kind of poofs out for you if you use it. It is very fun in that way. Remember that the yardage is for apparel wovens, which are usually about 54 inches wide, and quilting cotton is only 45 to 47, sometimes even 42 inches, so you will probably need more. When you're cutting your elastic, make sure to exercise your elastic. All that means is stretch it. Stretch it out before you cut your pieces. That will help that if your elastic is going to lose any of its recovery, it's going to lose it before you're putting it in. So if you don't do this, you risk cutting your elastic, and then as you're feeding it through the casings, the neckline, the sleeves, the waist, it's going to grow out on you and it's going to be too big. So just take the time to quickly pre-stretch your elastic before you cut it. Usually we call that exercising your elastic. For the sleeve option, you need to cut 2 sleeves, a neckline, and 2 waist elastics. The youth uses a 1/4 inch elastic and the adult uses 3/8 inch elastic. I'm just going to show one last trick here. If you're using an apparel woven that is pretty sturdy like this quilting cotton, I would not do this on something like linen that is more loosely woven, or something like rayon that might warp very easily. But I love to snip and rip my cotton wovens. It goes perfectly along the cross grain and grain, so you know it's perfectly straight. You do need to make sure that you iron it, and you need to iron it afterwards because it does loosen your threads a little bit. It weakens it, and once you iron it, usually that helps it kind of come back together a little bit. I like to do that though. You can always use your straight edge to cut it like any other pattern piece though, if you don't like to snip and rip. All right, we're starting in on our first step now. I have my front bodice and I'm aligning my sleeves. The front of the sleeve has a single notch. So you know right sides together with your front bodice, the single notch needs to go on your front piece. And then we're just going to repeat on the other sleeve on the other side. And we're going to stitch this with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I just use a normal old straight stitch here. I recommend leaving pretty much your full seam allowance when you're sewing woven fabrics. This is a quilting cotton again, so it's pretty tightly woven. It doesn't fray that easily. If you're using something like linen, flannel, something that's a gauze, something that is looser, it's woven more loosely and tends to fray easier, then absolutely leave the full seam allowance. Okay? We are going to finish these seam allowances in just a minute. I'm just repeating the same exact thing on the back bodice with the back sleeve. Again, the back sleeve has double notches. We're creating a big circle here. So when I finish off these seam allowances, I'm either going to take off a very scant amount or none at all, so that I leave my seam allowances intact. This really helps with your fabrics never fraying, especially if you're using one of those fabrics that tend to fray very easily. No matter what fabric you're using, you do need to finish your seam allowances. They will fray if you do not. We are also going to finish along the top edge of the bodice, which is the neckline, and then also the bottom edges of the sleeves. I'm using my serger to finish all of these seam allowances and edges. You can also use your sewing machine and a zigzag stitch, overcast stitch, whatever your favorite method is for finishing. Now we're going to take it to our iron and press the neckline and the bottom of the sleeve 3/8 of an inch to the wrong side. If you're doing the adult, you're going to press it 1/2 inch to the wrong side. Okay, now that we have a nice neat press, we are going to stitch along the very edge of where we just folded it down. Okay, so it's about 3/8 inch, or just inside 3/8 inch. Okay. And I like to start at a back seam, so where this back sleeve meets the back bodice on either side. And you can really start anywhere, but we are going to be threading our elastic through and then finishing the casing right there. I just always pick the back for whatever reason. Go nice and slow here. You want it very tight to the edge, and you also want to make sure you have it nice and even all around, especially if you're using a contrasting color of thread on your bodice. Again, I'm just using a normal old straight stitch here. One thing to note as well is you want to press all of your seam allowances going the same way. So all sweeping to the right or all sweeping to the left. Does not matter which way, but you do want them all sweeping the same way. That way, when you thread your elastic through, you're not fighting your seam allowances going different directions. Sometimes it can be really tricky if your seam allowance is going the opposite way from the direction you are threading your elastic in, to try to not get it stuck in between the seam allowance and your casing. So how to battle that is just to make sure all of your seam allowances are all going the same direction. Okay, so here's where I started. I'm going to leave about 1 inch unsewn, so I'm not going to make the full circle. I'm going to stop about 1 inch from where I started sewing. And this has created our neckline casing. Next up, we're going to stitch up the side seams, unfold our casing. I did pre-press that because I think it's easier doing that while it's flat. But you're just going to sew up the side seams through the armpit down our teeny tiny little sleeve. This is a little tiny cap sleeve, so there's not much of a sleeve. It's also kind of a sharp turn at the armpit. Don't worry about it. It just gets folded down into the casing anyways. There's basically no sleeve left after sewing the casing. It's almost like a really thick tank top. It's a little cap sleeve, very short. You do need to finish off these side seams, either with your serger, zigzag stitch, overcast stitch, whatever your favorite method is again. Once you're done with the side seams and you have finished them, we are going to repress that casing that we pressed in the flat. Should be nice and easy to repress that. And now we are going to sew all along this casing just like we did on the neckline, just under 3/8 of an inch. You want it at the very edge of this finished folded down little casing. And again, we're going to leave a little bit unsewn so that we can feed the elastic through. Again, I just use a normal straight stitch here and go nice and slow. You want this nice and even and right at the edge of your folded down fabric. If you aren't right at the edge and you're taking maybe like a 1/4 inch seam allowance, your casing is going to be really tight to feed through. You want a little bit of extra, so try to get it nice and close to the 3/8 inch. I'm speeding up the second sleeve just so you don't have to watch me do the same thing again. And now it's time to feed all of our elastics through. This should be a fairly easy casing to feed through. It shouldn't be too tight. Your neckline is woven, so it shouldn't be stretching along with your elastic. It should be a fairly smooth step. One thing that I like to do when I'm feeding elastic through any casings is mark the same side, just in case I accidentally flip the elastic. I've done it from time to time. It's super annoying. Marking the elastic on both sides only takes 5 seconds and it helps me not do that. So I usually try to do that when I'm feeding elastics through. I'm just finding where I left it unsewn. The last one that I try, of course. Again, my seam allowances are all pressed towards the right, so I'm going to feed my elastic in all going towards the right. That way I don't have to fight any of my seam allowances as I'm feeding them through. They'll just glide right over them. Using a safety pin, it's probably the only thing you're going to be able to use on this youth size because it is a small little elastic with a small little casing. If you're doing the adult, it's a little bit bigger. It's 1/2 inch with 3/8 elastic. You could probably use a bodkin or other tools. I find with this 1/4 inch elastic and the 3/8 inch casing, it's not enough wiggle room to use anything but a little safety pin. One thing to mention when you're feeding elastic through, if you haven't done this a ton, is that you want to keep pulling your elastic through so that you're not getting a giant amount of gathers right ahead. So you can see I'll go, feeding my safety pin, and then I'll pull the elastic in, making sure it's not getting twisted at all. Everything's looking nice and smooth. Another thing that I like to do is when the the back tail end of my elastic is getting a little small, I like to stick a clip towards the end so that it kind of acts as a little stopper that I can't accidentally pull the elastic all the way in to the casing. Because your elastic will be much smaller than the casing, it will gather it up and bring it in. Once you get all the way back around to your opening, you're going to pull the safety pin and elastic all the way out, and you're going to overlap your two ends. This is where I make sure my two markings are on the same side still, that I didn't accidentally twist my elastic. So I'm just going to overlap about a half an inch, and I like to use a little straight pin to hold them together, and I use a zigzag stitch to secure them together. If your machine is really not liking stitching your elastic, throw in a stretch needle and try again. My machines don't like to sew elastic with a universal needle, which is what you are probably using to sew up your apparel woven. So just a quick little zigzag to secure them together. And now what you're going to do is kind of pull your elastic all the way back inside the casing, just like this. Just tug, 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 and the elastic should pop all the way into the casing nicely. That will also kind of even out your gathers along the neckline and sleeves. Now all we have to do is sew up this tiny little spot. If this is the very first time you're making this pattern, I suggest leaving it open until you're completely done, and then sewing it up once you know you're happy with all the elastic links. Don't try it on yet. It's not ready to try on quite yet. I just use that little stamp for her to know which one is the back, by the way. You can also stick a little tag in there. Now we're going to repeat the casings on the sleeves. I'm going to speed it up because it's the exact same thing. I like to mark my elastics, thread it through, overlap, zigzag them secure, and I suggest not closing up that casing just yet. Once you are finished with the waistband, that's when I suggest trying it on and looking at all of the elastics then. Okay? That way, if you want to tighten or loosen any of the elastics, it's nice and easy. The casings are still open. You can just tug your elastic out, add some, take some out, and then close up the casings once you're all done. If you've sewn this before, you know you're happy with the elastics, you can go ahead and sew it up now. That's what I did because I had sewn her several of these and we had the elastic down exactly how I wanted. Now we're moving on to the waistband. This is my main. I'm using the same fabric for my main and my lining, so we're just sewing up the two side seams on the main, and then the same thing, the two side seams on the lining as well, which I'm using the same fabric here. Usually I would suggest pressing these seams open, but for this one, since our waistband is becoming our casings for our elastic along the waist, I suggest pressing them all the same way so that when you're threading your elastic through, it's not difficult. It is slightly bulkier that way. So you can choose whether you would risk having it be difficult to thread through. If you press your seams open, it might be difficult to thread through, not because of the bulk, but because you cannot see exactly where that safety pin is headed. And if it gets stuck between the seam allowance and the fabric, then you can't push your safety pin through. You have to slide it between your seam allowances. So it can be tricky. I like to press all of mine the same way so that that doesn't happen, because I get super frustrated when that does happen. But if you get super frustrated at the bulkiness or you don't like the feeling, then you can press them open. Now all I'm doing is that I'm aligning the centers to the bodice. So we're sandwiching, first I'm just doing my main waistband right sides together to the bodice, and we are aligning center back, center front, which I have my center back and center front marked on my waistband just by a nice crease. And then I have a notch on my bodices because I cut those out on the fold and I just added a quick notch. Now with our lining piece, we're going to do the exact same thing, but we're going to align the right side of our lining to the wrong side of our bodice. So we're sandwiching the bodice between the lining and the main waistband pieces. This gives a nice pretty seam right here. If your little one or you have kind of sensory issues about having more seams finished really nicely, I do not finish the bottom seam enclosed. So if that bothers you, there is a quick, really easy way to do that. You want to press your lining waistband up 1/2 inch to the wrong side along the bottom. And then when you sew the bottom waistband area, you're not going to sew the lining to it. You're just going to do main to the skirt. And then you flip down your lining and you stitch in the ditch. And that will enclose that seam for you if that bothers you. I never sew it that way because it's a little more time consuming, it's a little finickier, and my little one doesn't care and I don't care. So I go for the quicker, easier method that does not have that seam finished. If it bothers you, that's how you can finish it so that it is beautiful and it's more enclosed seams. Just sewing this with a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance, straight stitch, nothing fancy here. The waistband should be exactly the same as the bodice. If you used all the correct seam allowances and cut it out perfectly. The bodice does have a bit of a curve, especially the adult has quite a bit of curve because of busties. We're just curvier, so our pattern pieces have more curve. So you might be easing in this waistband a little bit, but they should not be drastically different at all. They should be exactly the same along the seam allowance. You do not need to finish this seam allowance here because it is fully lined and enclosed, but I do like to trim this seam allowance. This casing is really small, and so if you don't trim it, it will be pretty bulky. So I like to trim mine down using pinking shears. It should not fray on you. The pinking shears do battle fraying a little bit, but it is fully enclosed as well, so that will help it from fraying as well. Once we're done trimming this up, what we're going to do is take it to the iron. This is a really important step. You want to really take your time pressing this waistband on this step, because if not, it can make the rest of the waistband very difficult. So you want to press both your lining and your main waistband down, and your seam allowance will also be down. You want to make sure that you're pressing the lining separately from the main separately from the lining, and then all together. So what I do is I press the lining down, then I press my main down, and then I go over both with them both folded down. It's important that we don't have this waistband folded up at all and it's pressed really nicely and neatly. That way our bottom edge of our waistband is lined up perfectly. If that bottom edge of our waistband is not lined up perfectly with the lining and the main, it can get a little wonky and you can get a little frustrated. So take your time really pressing that seam right there. I like to sew the first casing now. You can wait until later, but I like to sew it now. It's 3/8 inch away from that top seam. So the seam that we just sewed the waistband to the bodice, we're just aligning our next stitch, a normal straight stitch, 3/8 inch away from that. On the adult, it's 1/2 inch. So if you are sewing an adult, you will be lining up your casing stitch 1/2 inch from the seam that we just sewed the waistband to the bodice. Remember to leave a small little part unstitched. I leave anywhere from a 1/2 inch to a full inch unsewn. Here you go. I always like to do it at a seam. I don't know why, I just do. So there's my little unsewn part. Right there, I left a little gap. And it should be nice and pretty on the inside as well. Next, we're going to work on the skirt. So we're going to grab our tier 1 skirts. This is a knee length dress, so my tier is fairly short. If you're doing a maxi length, your tiers will be a little bit longer. But your first tier, and we're just going to sew down the side seams and then finish those side seams as well. You can have a lot of fun with this tiered skirt, changing up the tiers, changing up the lengths. I know I only put 2 lengths in, a knee and a maxi, but my testers had a lot of fun with doing, maybe just the first 2 tiers of the maxi and getting like a knee length skirt with only 2 tiers, or leaving out that gathered band and getting a mini length. There was a lot of experimenting. I know they left the gathered band out in the maxi to get more of a T length. It's really fun. You can move them around, lengthen them, shorten them. But the math is all there for the width, which is usually what takes the longest time on gathered skirts like this. So have fun with it. I can't wait to see what everybody makes with this pattern. I really wanted to make myself a mini length by leaving out the gathered band on the knee length, but I just haven't had time yet. Baby girl really wanted this one for back to school, and she's my only one out of my 3 that really still likes back to school stuff. My baby boy did finally ask for a back to school shirt, but he waited until the day before, even though I had been asking him over and over if he wanted one. So I didn't have too much time to make him something special. It had to be thrown together. The skirt is attached just like the waistband, so it is exactly the same width as the waistband. We're just going right sides together. I do like to mark the center front and center back just to help me make sure I'm not easing anything in anywhere. So this should be 1-to-1, nice and easy waistband to first tier on the skirt. Again, we're going to sew it with a straight stitch, 1/2 inch seam allowance. This time we want to make sure we leave, that 1/2 inch to 1 inch unsewn. And I like to make sure that it aligns pretty closely to the same area that I left unsewn on the waistband. This is where we're going to sneak in our elastic. So you want it to be at the same spot just to make it nice and easy. So here's where I left it unsewn. That's where I'm going to leave it unsewn on this step as well. And all I'm doing is moving my clip to remind myself, hey, don't sew it right there. And if you sew it all the way around, it won't take too long to unpick a tiny little spot. But here I am reminding you, don't sew it all the way around. You will have to finish this seam allowance, but you do not want to finish it yet. You cannot finish this until we are all done with the elastic and the casings. So do not finish the seam allowance. I have it in the tutorial. Just as a reminder, don't do it yet. Sometimes it's habit, sew, finish, sew, finish, sew, finish. Do not finish this seam yet. Okay, once we're done, again leaving that little section unsewn, we're going to flip our skirt down and our seam allowance down. We're going to press both down, okay? And now we're going to sew our second casing line. We're going to use the bottom seam that we just sewed, so the tier 1 skirt and the waistband seam. And we are going to sew 3/8 inch away from that to create our bottom casing. For the youth, for the adult, you're going to sew 1/2 inch. And again, we're going to leave the same little area unsewn that we left right here. We're going to leave that unsewn on the casing as well. And you're going to watch me almost sew it at 1/2 inch. I did a couple, like a stitch or two, because 1/2 inch is the adult, and I almost missed it. It's 3/8 on the youth. Again, normal straight stitch here. If everything was aligned really nice and prettily, this should be really easy. This is the step where if you didn't cut super precisely or you didn't iron very nicely on the very first seam on the waistband, this can get a little bit wonky. Hopefully everything came out perfectly. Remember, if you have a little bit of wonkiness, once you put the elastic in, that's probably going to cover up a good deal of that. But that's why I really stress pressing that first waistband seam really, really well, so that the rest of your waistband lines up really nicely and neatly, just like this. Make sure that your seam allowance is pressed down here. You do not want to be top stitching your seam allowance down with your casing, because we have not finished it yet and we need to finish that seam allowance. So make sure that your seam allowance is down and not getting stitched on this step. we're coming back around to where we started, and we're going to leave that little section unstitched. So our top casing should have the little part, our bottom casing should have the little unsewn part, and our skirt where it attaches to our waistband should also have the little unsewn part. All kind of lined up, okay? So we're gonna grab waistband elastic now. And again, I like to mark mine quickly just to make sure it doesn't get twisted around on accident in there. I'm going to speed up the video just a little bit because it is rather boring watching me just feed elastic through this casing. We're going to finish it just like we did the neckline and the sleeves once we get it all fed all the way around. Just going to pull out that end, make sure they're not twisted, overlap them 1/2 inch, zigzag them together. Once it's secured in a circle, you can kind of tug it so that it goes all inside the casing. If you have sewn this before, or you have tested out that elastic before and you're ready to close up your casing, you can now. If this is the first time you've sewn it and you're not sure if the elastic is going to be tight enough or loose enough on you, don't close up your casing just yet, right? Leave it open and try it on now. This is the perfect time to try it on. You can thread your other elastic through as well to get an even better idea. But this is where I suggest trying it on, okay? Because this elastic is pretty easy to all get to right now. Once you put in the second elastic, it's not quite as easy. All right, so once you're happy with all your elastics, closed up your casing on your top, and now we're going to close up the casing on our bottom, okay? So we're gonna stitch along 3/8 of an inch, just that little part that we had left open. Now the only part left open should be where the skirt attaches to the waistband. We're gonna do this elastic threading one more time, y'all. We're almost done threading elastic on this pattern. We're almost there. But this is the price we pay for not having zippers or buttons. And you know what? Elastic is really grow with me friendly and weight fluctuating friendly. So it's worth it. Stick with it. This will grow with your little one if you're making it for your little one, and it will fit you if you go up and down a little bit as well. Now we're going to close the last section that we have opened, attaching the skirt to the waistband, just that little 1 inch we left open before. And now is when we can finish off this seam allowance as well. We waited and waited, and now it's ready. It is time. Finish off this seam allowance. Okay, now we can kind of move our gathers around wherever we want on the elastic. This pattern is drafted where there is more gathered in the center front and center back than on the side seams. It's really not meant to gather much under the armpits at all. So as you can see, I'm moving my gathers towards the center front and then towards the center back as well. I did that mostly for the thin strap option. I didn't want it gathered under my armpits. I just didn't like the way that felt. And so it is not gathered under the armpits, and so the bodice also isn't gathered very much under the armpits. I want most of the gathering right here, centered on the neckline area, especially on the thin strap option, but this one as well. If you don't do that and you have it all the way around, you're gonna have some extra fabric under your arms, both in the sleeved and especially the thin strap, you'll be able to notice more. So move your fabric and your gathering to the center front and the center back so that you don't have little poofy parts. on your side seam. Next tier. Now these tiers I'm going to speed up a little bit. They're the same thing over and over. You just got to keep on going, y'all. You sew up the side seams, finish them off, and then what we're going to do is we're going to run gathering stitches, and we're going to gather, and we're going to gather, and we're going to gather, and we're going to gather. And then we're going to have a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful tiered gathered skirt. I had quilting cotton again as a reminder, so my fabric was not as wide as apparel fabric, and you'll see I have to piece together these bottom tiers because it was not as wide as it was drafted for. The only thing I'll mention too, when you are piecing together, if you used a more narrow fabric like me, or even if you're not, the third and fourth tiers are 3 pieces, 4 pieces, things like that. Just watch where you align those seams. Personally, I always try to never have a seam at my center front. Just don't like the way that looks. A center back, fine, it doesn't bother me. So make sure when you're finding center fronts, center backs, sides, even quarter points on these skirts, just be aware of where those seams are and if it's going to bother you if it is at the front. Okay. So you'll see I'm finding my center front and back and then marking my side seams as well. So I put this one in the front so that I didn't have the seams. I had more seams on the back than the front, basically, since I had to piece it together. I like to sew my gathering stitches side seam to side seam. So I do one long continuous stitch from one side seam around the front to the other side seam. Then I stop. And I start another stitch from the side seam along the back. That's how I've always done it. I'm assuming that's how my mama taught me, and that's why it's been so long that I don't remember being taught that way, but that's the way I've always done it. So I'm going to assume that's how she showed me. I use 2 gathering stitches to do gathering. It is my most preferred method. There's a lot of different gathering methods out there. We even have a blog post on patternsforpirates.com if you're not sure what your favorite gathering method is. I think we share 5 really popular methods on that blog. I personally think that gathering by hand with 2 gathering stitches gives you the best results. It might not be the quickest, but I do think it gives you beautiful gathers every time. No matter the fabric, no matter what you're doing, this is the method that I think gives the best gathers. Okay, so this is my side seam I'm starting on. Remember to pull out tails. So like my sewing machine automatically cuts and there's no tail. So I almost forgot. I'm going to pull up my bobbin thread so that I have a little tail. The first row of gathering stitches, I'm going to do about 1/8 of an inch from the top. It doesn't really matter as long as it is smaller than our seam allowance. You want 1 row of stitches smaller. This is my center front. You can see I'm going to very carefully hop that needle. So I do 1 long continuous stitch until I get to the other side seam. That's how I like to have my gathering stitches. The next row we are going to do outside of our seam allowance. And that's what I think gives you a really beautiful gathering stitch. Something that happens a lot if you don't do this method is that you end up easing in a lot of the fabric instead of maintaining your gathers. So if you only do one row of gathering stitch inside your seam allowance, what happens is it's gathered at the top, but at your seam line, it's not as gathered. It is getting eased in along with the gathers. So it doesn't look as gathered. You'll see it as people saying, I lost my gathers. It looked gathered before I sewed it. Then I sewed my seam and it doesn't look as gathered anymore. That's what's happening, is all of that fabric is getting eased in versus maintaining your gathers. Okay, so here's my second row of gathering stitches. I do it about 5/8 inch away from the edge. It doesn't really matter as long as it is larger than our seam allowance. So anything bigger than 1/2 inch on this pattern. You need your first one smaller than 1/2 inch and your second one bigger than 1/2 inch. And what that does is it holds your gathers and it maintains all those gathers while you are stitching your gathering to your flat piece. So nothing is going to be eased in. You're not going to lose any of those gathers. It also helps your gathering look nice and straight because it is gathered on the top and the bottom. They look like straight little vertical lines, just how you want your gathering to look, instead of going diagonal or to the side at all. So we're going to go right sides together here. The top of your second tier of your skirt to the bottom of your first tier. And we're just lining up center front, center back, and your sides. I'm not using side seams on mine because I had to piece these together. And I had to use 3 pieces instead of 2. If you have normal pieces and you didn't have to piece yours, you can go ahead and use your side seams again on the second tier on most sizes. All the youth sizes, most of the adult sizes as well. I only did 2 links on the skirt because the skirt pieces had so many pieces with all the different tiers, and I didn't want to make anybody cut more tiers than they had to, more pieces. And so you'll notice on the adult pattern pieces, some sizes say tier 2 cut 2 pieces, some say tier 2 cut 3 pieces. Depending on your size, you have to cut more if they didn't fit along the width of that apparel fabric. And I didn't want to just make everybody cut that many pieces because personally I love less seams. So there's a lot of skirt pieces even though there's only 2 skirt lengths. That's why I say have fun with it, and leave off a tier, add a tier, lengthen it. You could do so many different skirts even just with these pieces, now that you know the width and the length of these. We're going to grab our bobbin threads. I do always like to do bobbin, so when I'm sewing my gathering stitches, I always make sure that I'm sewing it with the fabric facing up. That way when I have it right sides together, I have the bobbin to pull. I think that it gathers much more smoothly pulling the bobbin thread versus the top thread. Is that in my head? I'm not sure. I have always thought that, and so I don't know if that is just in my head or if it in fact is much easier to pull the bobbin thread. You can let me know if you agree with me or not. Is it in my head? I'm not sure, but I do always sew my gathering stitches with my fabric facing up so that it is the bobbin thread that I'm pulling. Just pulling until it's nice and gathered. It doesn't need to be perfect right now. I did so many of these skirts all in a row that I pretty much knew what it looked like being gathered the right amount. But if this is your first time, it doesn't need to be perfect. Just gather it until the skirt fits your flat skirt piece, your tier 1, okay? You do not need to even out the gathers perfectly on this step. Once you have gathered 3 sections, you basically have 4 sections: the front left, the front right, the back left. Once you have gathered 3 sections, this is where I like to start tying off my gathering bobbin threads. I like to do this before I try to even out my gathers in any way. I think it's so much easier to do once they're tied off. This is another way that you can really lose gathers if you skip this. So I'm just making sure it's nice and even, my gathered tier to my flat tier. And then I'm just going to take my 2 top bobbins, so the ones that I sewed at 1/8 of an inch, and I'm just going to tie them together. I usually tie them about 3 times, until they're secure, they're not going to come undone. And then I tie my 2 bottom ones at 5/8 of an inch together. Again, I usually just tie it a few times. And now that I have tied these, I'll go back and make sure my gathering is even. Okay. My last section here, I'm going to make sure it's nice and even, even all around after I tie off this last section. Without tying off the threads, I find it nearly impossible to get the gathering even at the side seams. So where my bobbin threads come out and I'm pulling the bobbin threads right there, I cannot get those gathers even right there without tying them off. I will have more gathers towards the center than towards that little section right here where I'm pulling the threads. Because if I try to even out those gathers, I just lose them to the bobbin thread. It is well worth the few seconds that it takes to tie off your threads and making it much, much easier. So once it's all even, again, I'm just going to tie them off. Top with the top, bottom with the bottom. I like doing it like that. When I was younger, I used to tie all 4 of them together at once. But then I noticed if I was sewing things with a serger, with knit, and instead of sewing with a straight stitch, then I would cut my threads. So I got in the habit of always doing top together and then bottom together. It's also easier to pull your basting threads out if you tie them top to top and bottom to bottom. Okay, so once we're done tying off our threads, because now our second tier is gathered to the exact width of our first tier, we're going to start moving our gathers around until they look perfectly even to us. This is something that might take some time if you're new to gathering and sewing. Again, the more you make of the same pattern, the more you get used to exactly how much it is gathered. This one is not gathered a ton because there's so many tiers. It would have been really heavy and a huge fabric hog if it was super gathered. So it is not super gathered. You can put as many pins and clips as you're comfortable with. I move my gathers around right now till I think they look pretty perfect. And then I also continue moving them around as I'm stitching my seam, just to make sure. That is when I am more meticulous. So I move them around now evenly around, but I make sure they're just perfect right before I stitch them on the machine actually. Again, this is not the very quickest gathering method, but I do think it gives very beautiful gathers. It's how I always gathered. I have tried all of the methods. There's zigzagging over, a thicker floss. There is using your serger. That one's actually my least favorite. I know a lot of people like that one. It's my least favorite. I do not like it. Um, and then there is gathering feet. Gathering feet tend to look more like tiny little pleats versus gathering. It's also not a lot of wiggle room on that one on how much it is gathering or not. You can also use elastic to gather up things. That gets pretty bulky if you're not careful. Um, so this is it. This is my favorite one. If you've never used this method, I hope you like it. And if you like another gathering method and it's your go-to, you can use whatever gathering method you like. This just happens to be mine. Now we're gonna sew 1/2 inch seam allowance, straight stitch here. And as you can see, I'm going to continue to make sure that I think my gathers are perfectly even right before I sew them. This is where I tend to be a little bit more meticulous rather than while I'm pinning it to it. I find usually I need to move around the gathers a little bit where I have my pins and clips. So that's why it's not done till it's done, right? It's not final till you make that stitch. So you can continue to move around your gathers until you're perfectly happy with them, until you stitch them down, right? If you see a section that's not perfect, take the time to fix it before. Another thing that you can do if you're using thinner fabric that doesn't look very gathered, and you're thinking this doesn't look very gathered, is before you stitch it, you can hit it with an iron and it will kind of hold those, crease those gathers into place. I'm using a quilling cotton so it gathers up pretty nicely and didn't feel the necessity to do that on this one. This is real time. I am going to speed up the other tiers a little bit because it's going to get very repetitive of me just gathering things over and over. But I know sometimes you just want to see sewing in real time, how long it really takes. And especially because this method gets knocked down because it takes a little bit longer, I am not going to speed this up because it is my favorite method and the one that I suggest using. We're almost back around. Again, you can see I'm just moving my gathers around till I'm just perfectly happy with them. Once we are finished all the way around, I do always suggest just flipping down your skirt and checking, making sure everything is perfect before finishing your seam allowance, But after you flip it down and you check and make sure nothing got caught anywhere, then you're good to finish this seam allowance as well. I like stitching with my gathered piece face up so that it's really easy for me to move them around. FYI. All right, we made it. We did it. We're all the way back around. So again, I recommend just double checking that everything looks just how you want it. And now we can finish off this seam allowance, either using your serger or zigzag stitch, overcast stitch, whatever your method is for finishing your seams. All right, and now I highly recommend giving this a press. Don't remove your basting stitches yet until you give it a press. This is another way that people will lose some of their gathered look, is skipping this press. So hold your fabric like this and give it a press. Don't move it up and down. Just put your iron on top, boop, like that, and that's it. Once you press it, then we can remove the basting stitch, and then I highly recommend giving it another press because you will have needle holes most likely from your basting stitches, and giving it a press will help pop those little needle holes smaller so they're not as noticeable. Okay, we're gonna go onto the gathered band. I do have this sped up because it is pretty much repeating the exact same step, okay? The only difference here is we are gonna run our gathering stitches along the top and the bottom of our gathered band. Again, two rows on the top, 2 rows on the bottom, one inside the seam allowance, one outside the seam allowance. It's a lot of gathering stitching, y'all, but you know what? This gathered band is so cute, okay? You can skip it and have a shorter dress. It's not too long, and I did that on purpose because I know some people might want to skip it. If you don't want your dress shorter, you can just add length to the other tiers and just have a 3-tiered skirt. But it is so cute, y'all. It is so cute. All right, so once you have gathered it to your main, there's a couple ways you can gather the bottom. You can pin it like this because we're gathering it the same width. Okay, so you can pin it to the skirt like this and then gather it to that skirt piece. Again, pulling those bobbin threads. We've already gathered the top. Now we're gathering the bottom. So I'm going to show you this way, and then I'm going to show you another way, okay? So your gathered band and your last tier are all gathered to fit the second tier. So whichever way you would like to do that, you could do that. Before you even gather the second tier, you could gather the top and the bottom and the tier 4 all to that width before it's even gathered if you wanted to. So here's one method. You can pin it up and gather it to fit just like this. Okay. I know I cut it off a tiny bit. I'm so sorry. Y'all, videoing seems so easy till you're doing it, and then it's not so easy. So this is one method, okay? I did do this on some of them. I found this one a little bit hard not to gather the bottom of my gathered band a little too much, though. I just tended to gather it a little too much when I use this method, even though you think, why? It's the same. But there you go. I did. And so here's another method that you can use. Oh, just kidding, I'm still doing this one. Okay, there you go. All right, now here's another method that you can use, and this is the one that I actually prefer, but you might not, so you can just think about it. I like to just gather my bottom tier until all my gathers look straight, and it looks like it's going straight down, and that's it. I just gather it to my eye. It should be the same amount of gathers on the top as the bottom. And so I just pull it and gather it until it looks very even. And I promise I noticed that I cut some of this off, and you'll be able to see a little bit better in just a minute. But you want the same amount of gathers on the top and the bottom, okay? And that's how I do my gathered bands now. I think it's the easiest, the quickest, and I got the best results this way. You might find it otherwise. But it is the same amount of gathering. You can see I gathered it a little too much. Now I'm spreading out my gathers a little more. There you go. So this is how I like to do it. I just eyeball it. You can see it looks like a ruffle right now where the bottom is much looser than the gathered section. And I just gather it until it looks exactly the same. Like it's going straight down all across, and that there's the same amount of gathers on the top as the bottom. Again, you can do it where you gather the fourth tier and the gathered band all at the same time. They're all gathered to the same width. They're all gathered to the finished width of tier 2. So whichever way you want to do that, you can do that. This is how I like to do it. I had some testers that struggled with getting the gathered band to hold its gathers, but all the same tips that I gave on the first gather are the same here. So the 2 rows of gathering stitches is going to help hold your gathers. Pressing your gathers before you take these basting stitches out. Very important, both of those, I believe, and getting really nice, pretty gathers, okay? Some fabrics that aren't gonna hold a crease are just gonna look a little different as well. So this is quilting cotton. It wrinkles and creases very easily. So the gathers look very defined, okay? I used like a bubble crepe on one of mine, and no matter how much I pressed that bubble crepe, it's not going to hold the presses and the creases very well. So those gathers don't look as defined. So if you want your gathered band to look very gathered and see those gathers very nicely and crisply, pick something that holds a press well. Okay? And press, 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 press. Before you take those gathering stitches out, press. And I also am going to say one more time, I think the 2 rows of gathering give a more beautiful gather in the end. All right, I'm going to speed up this next section because I'm just going to continue to be gathering, 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 gathering. Once I gather these exactly the width that I want, I'm just going to tie off the ends. Now we're doing tier 4, which is labeled the skirt knee ruffle if you're doing the shorter length, and the bottom tier if you're doing the maxi length. We're just going to do this tier exactly like we did tier 2. So we're going to run the 2 gathering stitches, and then we're going to gather it up to be exactly the same width as our gathered band, which is exactly the same width as our tier 2. I'm going to speed it up because I'm just going to be gathering and gathering and gathering. So enjoy watching me gather. And now that we're all gathered up, we're sewing up our last tier to our gathered band. This has gathering on both pieces, so you do need to be careful while you're stitching. I still peek both under and on top and make sure that the gathering is exactly how I want it before I stitch that section. This is a good one to press before you stitch so we're not losing any gathering on either side. It'll probably be the bottom side that you lose gathers on more because that is going through the feed dogs. So just be aware of that. Again, I like to move my gathers around right here, and I peek underneath to make sure that they're still looking nice and straight and even as well. You have to go a little bit slower on this section because you are sewing gathering to gathering. It's just a little bit more difficult for most sewing machines. So go nice and slow and make sure you're giving your machine time to go through this kind of thicker textured seam here. My sewing machine never had a hard time sewing it. Just want to make sure this is not a pedal to the metal step. Okay, you're gonna have to go a little bit slower so you're not losing gathers anywhere. You should not lose any gathers because we tied these off and because we did 2 rows. So we should not be losing gathers. This is our last chance to make sure they're nice and even on both sides before we stitch these suckers together. If you're using a fabric that tends to be not holding on to your gathers very well, not holding a press very well, you can use a smaller stitch length here to help get a lot of stitches on these gathers so that you can hold all of these gathers in place as well. I did that for my one that I did in rayon. So my yellow one that I did in a rayon, it's kind of a silky, thin fabric. And the thinner the fabric, the less gathered it looks already. And then the rayon doesn't hold a press and gathering quite as well as something more stable like this. Quilting cotton as well. So I did a smaller stitch length sewing that one up. Try to help hold all those little gathers in place. Once we're done sewing all around this circle, then we'll be ready to just double check it looks perfect and then finish off this seam allowance, just like we did with the other tiers as well. Again, I highly recommend giving it a really nice, good press before removing any of these basting stitches. All right, and I cannot resist speeding this up a little bit. I'm just sewing a straight line here, straight stitch, making sure my gathers are even on the front and the bottom side. Can double check everything's looking good. And then we're gonna finish our seam allowance here. I'm gonna use my serger, but you can also use your sewing machine, whatever your favorite method is for finishing your seam allowance. Here's what it looks like. And we're gonna take this and do a really nice press. And I'm actually gonna show you exactly how I press these at the end on my ironing board, because I do think it's important to get a really pretty finish that you press these really nicely. I'm going to do a narrow hem along the bottom. We only have a 1/2 inch hem allowance on this dress, so you have to do a narrow hem. You can use a narrow hem foot if you have one. If not, this is my favorite cheat method to doing a narrow hem. I use a serger to finish off the edge, and my serged edge is a 1/4 inch, and I just use that 1/4 inch serged hem and I fold it to the wrong side and then to the wrong side again, and it is the perfect width for a 1/2 inch little narrow hem, and it is super quick and it's super easy, and it usually looks really great. The only fabric that this doesn't really work on is if there's something sheer, and then you can see the serged threads inside. Okay, but if you have opaque fabric, this is a really easy, foolproof method of getting a narrow hem. If you do not have a serger, another trick is to sew a stitch at a 1/4 inch and then use that as you fold it under and under again. All right, so we're all the way around, and now our dress is complete. We just need to give it a final press. I hope you enjoyed sewing along with me on this Lizzy dress. This is the dress that my daughter asked for back to school, and I thought I would do a video sewing along, because why not? Here is how I like to press gathers, and my final thing, this is my phone holding up my phone, this big white thing in the bottom, it's holding my phone. But here's how I like to do it. I like to open my dress, put it on my ironing board, and then the part that is being gathered, I like to pull nice and straight and gathered. And then you're just gonna put your iron on top and hit it with as much heat and steam as your fabric can have. This is a quilting cotton, so I have it cranked up high and high steam. You want your flat piece nice and flat, and then I like to kind of make, instead of letting my skirt flare out on this right side, I like to make it kind of go down straight so it shows those gathers dramatically, right? See how I'm gathering up the bottom as well? And then I'm just going to put my iron down and steam it. I'm not going to rub my iron all around, okay? And again, I highly, highly, highly recommend doing this press before you take out your basting gathering stitches, and again after you take out your basting stitches. Before you take them out, because that's going to give you gorgeous, gorgeous gathers, okay? And then after, because after you take out the basting stitches, you're most likely going to have little holes. I'm also just ironing my center front and back creases out right here. I'm almost done with this tier, and then I'll show you the gathered band quickly just because it's a little different than most tiers or ruffles. But I basically do the same thing where I am kind of pulling my skirt nice and straight. There we go. So nice and flat on the bottom, on the left side, it's nice and flat at that top seam. And then we're just pulling it nice and straight and hitting it with our iron. This is just going to hold our gathers nice and beautifully, make them nice and crisp, and yeah. I hope this helps if you are struggling getting your gathered band to kind of hold its gathers, look super gathered, look nice and even. Here it is. A nice press will do wonders. Again, if your fabric is just fabric that's not going to hold a press, there's not a lot you can do. You can see I moved my iron around too much on that one. And I'm going to hit it again, just moving up and down, and it's going to look slightly better. So try not to move your iron around too much. You're just pressing it on top of it. There we go. And I just move up and down because I'm trying to press the top seam and the bottom seam at the same time. All right, I removed my basting stitches and now I'm gonna press again. I'm not gonna show the whole press again, but I'm just proving to you that I do in fact press before I remove my basting stitches and then I press again. And it's because these little holes here, and if you just hit it with a little steam, it helps close those holes up. So I don't just recommend it, I do also do it myself. And we're done with our Lizzy dress. I hope you enjoyed sewing along with me and pressing along with me and gathering along with me. This dress is named after my very favorite literary character, Lizzie Elizabeth Bennet. I named it Lizzie because it's got an empire waist and the little peasant style, which makes me think of that time period. But also, I named it Lizzie instead of Elizabeth because it's definitely a little playful take on that look, and probably as close as I'm gonna get to ever drafting anything that looks like what they might have worn during Pride and Prejudice times. So we went with the Lizzie. I hope you enjoy it. I can't wait to see yours. Please don't forget to tag me if you make one up. I absolutely adore seeing your makes. It makes me smile every time. Remember that the gathering in this one is meant to be towards the front and the back. It'll wear prettier if you remember that. It won't get puffy under your arms. I hope you enjoy the twirl and the swishiness of this full tiered dress and skirt. I'll see y'all next time. Bye, y'all.